Borders on every map were never meant to last. The lines dividing nations today are no more permanent than the fading edges of empires that once believed they were eternal. There are no explosions, no dramatic announcements, just a slow, almost invisible shift, so subtle that most people don't even notice it happening, until one day the world no longer looks the way you remember. Borders don't always fall in war. Sometimes they simply stop mattering, and when they stop mattering, everything built on top of them, power, identity, control, begins to change in ways that are difficult to reverse. This is the fate flip history, where we don't just study the past, we rewrite it. For most of human history, borders felt permanent. They defined who you were, where you belonged, and who held power over your life. They shaped economies, cultures, and entire civilizations. But history tells a far more unstable story. Empires like Rome and the Ottomans once seemed unshakable, symbols of absolute control and permanence, until they weren't. Their borders didn't disappear overnight. There was no single moment when everything collapsed. Instead, they eroded slowly, almost invisibly, weakened by internal shifts, until the system holding them together finally gave way. And that's where the pattern becomes dangerous. Because what if the next shift doesn't come from war, but from irrelevance? At first, everything looks normal. Governments function as they always have. Borders remain on maps. Flags still represent nations. People continue their daily lives without questioning the structure around them. But beneath the surface, something far more powerful begins to emerge. A system that doesn't recognize borders as limits, but as outdated constraints. Digital economies begin to outpace national ones. Corporations expand across jurisdictions without friction. A designer in one country works for a company in another, paid through systems that no single government fully controls. A developer on one continent builds systems used on another, never crossing a border physically, yet fully integrated into a global structure. At first, it feels like freedom, efficiency, progress, a natural evolution of a connected world. But then, something changes. Governments begin losing control, not over land, but on systems. Money flows across invisible channels that bypass traditional oversight. Regulations struggle to keep up with technologies that move faster than law itself. Authority, once tied to territory, begins to weaken, not suddenly, but gradually, almost imperceptibly. And that's where the real shift begins. Now, imagine an ordinary person. Their income, their work, their daily life are no longer tied to where they live. Borders still exist on paper, but their influence fades in practice. Their opportunities are global, their dependencies are digital, and their reality is no longer defined by geography. And that's where it becomes dangerous, because borders were never just lines. They defined responsibility, protection, and control. They determined who answers for what and who protects whom. When they lose meaning, so do the systems built around them. And here's where it gets unsettling. Unlike past empires, there is no clear replacement, no new dominant power rising to take control. Instead, power fragments. It spreads across networks, platforms, and digital systems with no visible center. Control becomes decentralized, but also harder to understand. At the same time, people begin to change. A new generation grows up connected globally, not locally. They collaborate across continents, consume the same information, and exist within shared digital cultures. The idea of identity begins to shift. The lines between us and them start to blur. At first, it feels like evolution, like progress, but every transformation carries consequences. As borders fade, stability begins to weaken. Legal systems struggle to enforce rules across decentralized environments. Accountability becomes fragmented. Responsibility becomes unclear. And people begin to feel something they can't explain. A quiet, growing sense of disconnection from control. And when people feel disconnected from power, they don't remain passive. They react. Some demand stronger borders, more control, a return to clearly defined systems. Others fully embrace the borderless world, adapting to its flexibility and unpredictability. And that tension begins to reshape everything: politics, economies, and societies. So here's the question you need to ask yourself. If borders disappear, what replaces them? Because halfway through this shift, something unexpected happens. Not a war, not a financial crisis, not a visible crisis, but a failure within the very systems that replaced borders. A disruption in global networks, a breakdown in digital infrastructure, a moment where coordination fails, not because of conflict, but because of complexity. And suddenly, the absence of structure becomes a weakness. Because without borders, responsibility is unclear. Without defined authority, coordination becomes fragile. Without structure, response becomes delayed. And in that moment, the world is forced to confront something it had quietly forgotten. Borders were not only about division, they were also about organization. But instead of returning to the old world, something new emerges, a hybrid system. Some regions attempt to rebuild strong national frameworks. Others move further into decentralized, borderless systems. The world doesn't unify under one model. It splits into multiple realities, not divided by geography, but by systems. And conflict doesn't disappear. It evolves, no longer over land, but over data, networks, access, and control. Because in this world, borders didn't vanish, they transformed. They became invisible. Now imagine a normal person again. They live globally, work digitally, connect without limits. They are freer than any generation before them, but also more dependent than ever before. Because if access is restricted, everything disappears. Their income, their connections, their place in the system. That's the paradox. A borderless world feels limitless until you realize the limits are still there. They've just become harder to see. So what if borders don't collapse in a single moment? What if they simply fade, slowly, silently, until one day you realize the world operates on entirely different rules? And what if, by the time you notice, it's already happened? This is the Fate Flip history, where we uncover hidden timelines, global power shifts, and the fragile systems shaping our reality. So now the real question isn't whether borders can disappear. It's whether we would even recognize it if they already had. Was the world ever truly divided by lines on a map? Or were those lines always temporary agreements in a system that was constantly evolving? Tell me what you think. Would a borderless world bring freedom or a new kind of control? And if history has taught us anything, it's this: what feels permanent today is often the first thing to disappear.